Now, I'd like to welcome to the show Professor Jeremy Horpedahl, Director of the Arkansas Center for Research in Economics, the University of Central Arkansas. Welcome to Free the Economy, Jeremy.
Thanks. Great to be here.
So, I'm glad we had a chance to do this episode because I have admired your heroic social media presence in which you attempt to correct an avalanche of statistical and economic misunderstandings on a regular basis, in addition to talking and commenting about your main interests. Um, so that can be difficult to do in a place, i.e., social media, where a lot of people don't read past the headlines, even when they are commenting and retweeting about complex ideas and arguments. So from inflation adjustments to economic inequality and historical living standards, or sometimes we're talking about time scales versus age scales. You and a small merry band out there of economic experts managed to keep somewhat some of econ Twitter honest. So when it comes to a lot of this sort of popular economic discourse, we have a lot of kind of misunderstandings and confusion about statistics and the math. Do you think we've gotten dumber about talking about economics in the past 25 years, or is it just sort of the ubiquity of Twitter uh, shows off the fact that a lot of people maybe haven't thought things through?
Yes, I would agree with that. Social media format, I mean, I like it and I hate it. It does allow for, great ways to distribute ideas and correct people in a very quick manner. I think if there are clear factual errors. So I don't know if we're dumber, but I think it is a medium that does thrive on, the quick takes that satisfy some people's, existing biases and then they get kind of the corrections. Well, they can be quick. They often don't come fast enough, and I think that these bad ideas can get spread. But I think that there is a sense in which it is a way for, what I've experienced is a lot of journalists use Twitter mostly not to tweet, but to follow people. And when there is, when CNN is doing, a fact check on government debt, they'll see, who's writing about this. And it's a way to say, okay, if I've been trying to put good information out there, then they will reach out to me. And that's the way that, social media might connect with more traditional media. In that I think it's a place that journalists and policymakers, are often lurking on there just to see, who would be a good, expert on this topic, or at least someone who has at least taken an honest look at the data, even if they're not an expert.
Yeah, and so I feel like there's a few big topics here that that I see and that there's a lot of traction with. You know, one of them I think is sort of maybe a phenomenon where sort of a little bit of knowledge can be dangerous. And lots of people know that inflation reduces the real value of money over time, and so adjusting nominal dollar amounts for inflation needs to be done. When you compare cost of things, 50 years ago versus today, the same $10 doesn't buy the same stuff. Um, so people obviously understand that, but people sometimes also insist that inflation adjustments are needed even after they've already been done. When data somewhere says, "Oh, this is in real dollars," and then someone will say, "Okay, well now adjust it for inflation." And I know our former guest on this show, Matt Darling, another popular econ Twitter guy, is always responding to these kinds of posts. Um, Sometimes people will spontaneously add their own back of the envelope adjustments and then double adjust for inflation. So when it comes to that, that's a thing that I think most people kind of they it's not a super arcane technical concept. Like they know what inflation is. They've got a vague idea about how it works. But how good do you think we are at understanding how inflation works and how it kind of works into our calculations? And then the question of which of the free market economists people always talk about, which is the difference between how good are we at understanding the difference between cyclical rises in prices for certain goods versus overall monetary inflation.
Yeah, I think this is an area where, like you said, people know a little bit about it and then, but don't really understand the nuances. So I think one way this shows up is that if someone will point to a price from the past, say a car was $3,000 in 1970, they'll say, okay, let's inflation adjust that price. This is actually an incorrect use of inflation adjustments. We can just look up the prices of things today. We don't need to inflation adjust that. What you want to use inflation adjustments for is when we're looking at income or wages from the past. So we want to say, okay, if someone has this salary in 1970, what are all the things they can buy compared to, what salary would you need to buy all the same things today? That's what an inflation adjustment is actually doing for you, is to make those numbers from different times comparable, given that since 1970 we've had, you know, 5 times inflation or something like that. So we need to make those adjustments. I think that a lot of people, though, especially if you are somewhat pessimistic about economic growth, people will often tend to think that the inflation adjustments are, overstating how well we are today, that they're somehow not capturing some price increases. And people will point to something such as housing costs. Well, housing costs have certainly gone up much more than the consumer price index over the last 50 years, or especially over the last 20 years. So they say, well, because you can't buy a house, somehow that inflation adjusted dollar amount is no longer relevant. But the nice thing about a price index, whether it's the consumer price index or other variations on that or other indexes, is that they take into account all the things people buy, not just houses, not just education, not just health. It takes account all things people buy and the proportions in which they buy them. Now those proportions change over time. In 1950, people were spending 30% of their income on food. Now it's 10%. So you can't like perfectly make these comparisons, but the inflation adjustment is supposed to capture all those things, so we don't resort to anecdotes like, oh, a can of Coke was 5 cents and today, the mini Coke is $2, right? Like, well, that seems like we must be worse off because incomes haven't kept up with that. But we want to adjust for all the things that people buy, and a good price index will try to both do that and make appropriate adjustments over time as people change their spending patterns. But I think that is something where there is so much confusion about it, even though, as you said, people know you need to do it, but they don't really understand what it's for, other than the dollars aren't worth the same amount. And that leads to lots of confusion, which leads to lots of Twitter conversations.
Well, yeah, and I also think one angle here that I know some people I know have written about, which is uh, inflation adjustment for a certain good can be pretty straightforward when the status and nature of that good is durable, right? So a dozen eggs are a dozen eggs, um, and a pound of beef is pretty much a pound of beef. But a TV, if the category is just a television, then a television in 1955 that was small and black and white is not the same as a medium-sized television in 1980 that was in color, and it's certainly not the same as a streaming capable, internet connected, smart flat screen TV today. Uh, so there are kind of quality adjustments in some of these goods that, economics writers have dug into. This is not a sort of an unexplored area, but it's just that uh, some of the comparisons are kind of obvious and straightforward with the things that don't change much over time. Uh, but for some of these categories, the quality of the thing we're buying, even if it's described by the same word or phrase, has increased so dramatically that just adjusting that price for inflation actually really undersells uh, our quality of life today, I feel like.
Yes, I would agree with all that. And also say that, any good price index, like the consumer price index, does attempt to make adjustments for that. So if you look at the CPI, component for televisions, it looks like it's falling over time. Like televisions are like 5% of the cost of what they were, 50 years ago. Now that's not actually true, right? So that's the quality adjustment saying, for the same quality of television back then, and based on what people are willing to pay, it tries to make that adjustment. This does lead some people to be skeptical of these indexes, to say, well, it's still, a TV is still a TV, right? And so if you're making this big adjustment, is that kind of, you know, overstating it or understating it in some way? So actually, one thing that uh, Scott Winship and I, who's at the American Enterprise Institute, wrote a paper a couple of years ago, responding to a paper by Orrin Cass, and we said, okay, let's not do a quality adjustment. Let's just look at the actual cost of buying things like in 1985, the cost of buying a car, the cost of buying a house. Like, don't do any quality adjustments. And we still did find people are actually able to buy more of the things, the main things people buy. So we kind of are recreating a consumer price index almost without doing quality adjustments. But I do think those are important, right? That is an important part of, you know, today the median house has air conditioning. In 1970, the median house did not, right? Like this is a very big quality difference. There were houses that had air conditioning back then, so we can compare the price of those. to the price of houses today. But the median house then did not have one, right? The median house was almost half the size of what the median house is today. So I think recognizing those and making at least some adjustment for it is good. And a price index will do that, but that's not some sort of trick. That's actually really trying to capture increases in well-being that are not reflected in prices.
Well, yeah, and I think when some people try and argue that we're in effect, overcorrecting for increased quality, and they say, well, a TV is still a TV. Maybe it's marginally better now, but it's not that much better. It's still essentially the same thing. I would ask, how many people would pay full cost for the 1955 TV, right? If the
Right.
answer is essentially zero, then it's not as good, right? I think consumer demand, there's ways that you can operationalize or quantify that, and measure that in a rigorous way. But I think just as sort of an intuitive way, either if either the current versions we have, whether they're cars or televisions or other technological retail items, either they are massively better as these quality comparisons would suggest, or somehow there's a mystery market for people who are willing to buy the 11-inch black and white TV that's just not being filled, and it doesn't seem like that's probably the case. So we got inflation, we got that under control, or at least
Kind of, yeah.
conceptually. Now employment. So here's another thing that is an economic statistic that is commonly talked about, that's kind of important and significant, that again, not terribly arcane. People kind of understand having a job and not having a job, right? And when more people are unemployed, that's probably a bad thing. So, but one kind of set of variables here that I think is interesting, uh, that maybe it doesn't get talked about enough, is the difference between what we talk about 99% of the time, which is the unemployment rate. People within a certain age range who are looking for a job but can't find one. And then the labor force participation rate, which is, everyone who's working minus everyone who's not working, whether they're actually looking for a job or not. Um, and we've had, some people like Nick Eberstadt, at the American Enterprise Institute, has written a lot about this in the past couple of years. He's written a couple editions, I think, now of his book Men Without Work.
Mhm.
And he makes an argument maybe we should spend less time looking at the short-term unemployment rate and more at the long-term labor force participation rate. Um, do you think regular human beings out there know the difference between those two things, and should they?
I think that people have a sense of what it is, especially, even if they don't know how the unemployment rate is defined. I think you could very quickly explain to them, right, that this is only including the set of people who are either working or looking for work, right? So, and that's a good starting definition, right? That's going to exclude people who are you know, retired of their own volition. It's going to exclude people who are choosing not to work because they're either in school or taking care of the home, right? And, you know, in some measure of, that's like a good first measure, right? But I think for all these things, especially for thinking about the labor market, I think it is always good to look at lots of ways of looking at the labor market. So not just the unemployment rate, but the labor force participation rate, the employment to population ratio, how are wages doing? Like all these things are things we need to look at to fully judge, you know, how is the labor market doing now? Is it improving? Is it getting worse? So I think, we need to look at all those. I think one challenge, though, with some of these other measures, like the labor force participation rate, is people often just look at the base rate, which includes all people 16 and older. And as the age composition of the population changes, both not only, of course, the huge, growth in the retired age population, but even, more people choosing to go to school longer, right? If you're just always looking at the 16 plus population, that rate probably is going to go down over time, not only because of aging, but just because of changes in how people view work. So I think that, that's a good second statistic to look at. But looking at a statistic like that for the working age populations, I think is a better way to go. So saying, what's the labor force participation rate of people who are in whatever you consider the prime working years? 25 to 54 is common, but you could expand that to some extent. And in Eberstadt's work, he does look at specifically male labor force participation rate, and he's a very careful scholar, so he looks at the working age population. In his work, he does find there is, about 7 million, fewer men working than we would expect if the participation rate was the same as it was in, I think he does like 1960, right? And that is true that for men of working age, there has been some drop in that rate. And we can think about, how much of that should we be concerned about? What are the reasons men aren't working? But if we look at the entire labor force, which includes now, of course, a lot more women than in 1960, that the number of people working that are of what we consider working age is as high or higher than it's ever been. The only time maybe it's closely or a little bit higher was the late 1990s, which is the last time we had a really good labor market. So I think it is very important to look at those, but as you start to throw out more and more statistics, that's I think when normal people's eyes kind of glaze over and they say, okay, maybe we should just go back to one. What's the one thing we can look at, right? They said must be something better than the unemployment rate. Okay, but now I've given you five things, and now your eyes are glazing over. So, I mean, just to kind of just circle back, I think what we do find is that the unemployment rate actually is a pretty good indicator. It actually correlates pretty well with all the other ways, the other nuanced ways of measuring the labor force. So the unemployment rate, that good one that most people kind of know and probably have some idea of how it's defined, actually does a pretty good job of giving us a first cut at how the labor market's doing.
And it's interesting to think about the ways in which when you have a long-term, because right, statisticians and economists love data sets that have uh, lots and lots of years of data, so they can compare. But when you have, and which we do in this country, we've got great economic statistics. Some of them go back many decades. But it's interesting to think that over a long enough time scale, society itself could sort of change in a way that makes those certainly at least the cutoffs less relevant. Like when you talked about starting the like labor force stats at age 16 and above. Well, as someone who did not want to be pressured to get a job when I was in high school, I was trying to avoid being part of that labor force participation rate as much as possible, and I feel like 100 years ago, uh, living standards were lower. The average household, the median household had a lot less money to spend. 16-year-olds were much more likely to get jobs, but 16-year-olds were less likely to graduate from high school, right? And to be expected to go on to college. So you had, I feel like you had a much higher cultural expectation in previous generations that 16, 17, and 18-year-olds would have jobs, including full-time jobs.
Yeah. Hmm.
Today, so just because of, so on one hand, you would say, oh, well, the labor force participation rate is going down among people in this group that includes people in their teens, then maybe that's bad. But maybe it's just a sign we're a richer society and people, and middle class people buy their kids cars and pay for their insurance and don't expect them to get jobs at all.
Yeah, I mean that is one thing that could be a sign of rising prosperity. And I think in many ways it is. But that's where you want to look more into detail of, why are fewer 16-year-olds working today? Or why are fewer 30-year-old men working, right? Like what is the reason for that? And so just having the number of how many are working is like the starting point, I think, for the conversation. And you want to go deeper, and there's, various survey data you can look to, of why people aren't working, and of the people who aren't working, what's their education level, what's their family income. And so I think that, you know, the fact that, fewer men of working age are working, that could be a very positive sign. Maybe that's, an indication that they don't feel as compelled to work. Maybe it's an indication that, a lot more women are working, so the men some years won't have to. But it also could be a negative sign that they can't find work, right? And so just having the number doesn't tell you that. And that's why we need to, refine that in various ways. And just to come back to, this roughly 7 million working age men not working, according to, this is harder to quantify, but, the best data that I've seen from a number of different types of data is that the main reason they're not working is because they're on some sort of disability. Either they qualify for government disability or they just self-indicate as being disabled. And so that's kind of a mixed thing. Like, okay, are they doing that because of the government program? Are they doing it because, the nature of their work led them to be disabled? Like, but that is actually that's the big factor that's driving that number. And you can spin that in a couple of different ways, but that's kind of the more detail we want to know. If we think it's a social problem, how do we address it? It certainly isn't from that data suggesting it's international trade, say, that's causing
Right.
it, right? It's something else going on, either about the nature of their work or government programs. And learning why it is leads us to say if there is a policy solution to this, we need to have a lot more information about why the numbers are moving the way they are, because it could just be a sign of we're wealthier, so 16-year-olds don't have to work. It's not because they're lazy. It's not because the labor market's bad. It's just because we want them to enjoy those last few years of youth. We want them to focus on school, and that's actually a good thing, right? So that's the kind of where those, again, that just like the unemployment rate, those statistics are like an entryway into learning more about how the labor market and people are doing.
Yeah, and I think you sort of led us into there. The next big, the other big topic here I had down, which is tariffs. Hot topics indeed.
Yeah.
And I feel like this is a good one. This one is a good example of the warning we got from Frederick Bastiat and later Henry Hazlitt about wanting to look not just at the obvious and immediate effects of a policy, but the sort of long-term and widespread effects to determine whether it's a good policy or not. To in the mystical phrase that's so popular, those writers to see the seen and see the unseen. I always like that phrase.
Yeah.
So, so President Trump likes to brag about, for example, the billions of dollars of revenue that tariffs are bringing into the federal treasury, which money's pouring in. But he doesn't talk a lot about the sort of second order effects of tariffs that have to do with depressing and adding friction to economic activity in general, and among lots of other things. So, and that's before we get to questions about things like now the federal government is going to be sending welfare checks to farmers because the Trump administration tariff policy has choked off their export market for soybeans, and so on and so forth. So, what would the verdict look like on our current tariff regime if we count up all the relative effects, if we try and see the unseen, and just on a more kind of conceptual level, how many sort of outer rings of ripples do we need to be looking at before we think we've gotten to most of the effects? How long do we need to
Yeah.
keep doing these analyses before we figured, well, we probably got most of the important information?
Yeah, I think there is, a lot of, as with many things, we can pick on Trump all day, but Trump, like any politician, is going to, focus on the benefits he thinks his policy is creating and to either downplay or ignore the costs. Although it is interesting, I think in real time we're seeing this play out. The unintended consequences or the second order effects or the unseen effects of tariffs are really playing out, and we're starting to see them. Just so the farmers, right? The effect on farms from this. I mean, I live in Arkansas. Ag is, I mean, sometimes it's oversold how big it is, but it's certainly bigger here than it is in most states. And the news here is talking about all the time the effects of this on farmers. In addition to this coming off, 2024 was actually a bad year for ag anyway, and this is something that you are seeing that second order effect. And Trump does have to talk about it. Now he talks about it in the context of I'm going to help them too, but this has become so big that it just cannot be ignored. It's a big part of his constituency. This happened in the first Trump term as well. So this is something which is a kind of unseen effect, but it was not unexpected, right? Like this was known that this would probably happen, both from tariffs increasing the cost of many of the inputs farmers use, but also retaliation from other countries. Like these were totally predictable, and economists talked about them all the time, and now here they are happening. Other things they're playing out in real time is there are certain things which we just cannot produce, or it would be so extremely expensive to produce. Things like bananas or coffee, and and economists had talked about this when they first started rolling out, the reciprocal tariffs, as they called them, on everyone. And just very recently, the Trump administration has said, okay, we're actually going to put in all these exceptions for things that we can't make here, right? So we're starting to actually see an acknowledgement of these second order and unseen effects. Now, how far do you keep going? I think that at a minimum, you want to say you got to look at how this is affecting cost of inputs for American manufacturing. If one of the primary goals of Trump administration's tariffs are to, benefit American manufacturing and American manufacturing workers in various ways, you must look at how this is going to affect their costs. And you must look at, is there going to be retaliation? And so I think that those are kind of a minimum ripple effect you want to look at. But I think, looking at, I'm always in favor of going as far as possible to add them up. Now, the more ripples out you go, the smaller the numbers get to add up. But certainly how this affects the cost of making goods in the United States, if that's one of the goals of the policy, right? Here we can be totally, kind of non-ideological and non-theoretical as we can be to say, like, this is your goal to help American manufacturing. Here's the effect of it. And, what's the net effect of, them being protected, but also their costs going up. That's something we can actually, analyze and hopefully have a reasonable answer about in somewhat real time.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few of those examples that I think stand out as more kind of easy to communicate when it comes to the effect of tariffs, like the idea of questioning whether we should have tariffs on things that we can't produce domestically. My mother-in-law has in Alabama, she has a banana tree in her backyard, but I
Mhm.
don't think she's ready to scale up to commercial production capacity. um, uh,
Yeah, and they make some coffee in Hawaii, right? But
mhm.
like that's like 1% of the market, right? You'd have to scale up 100 times.
So, you know, we can go back to what you'd mentioned, I think, with some of our populist economic writers. Sometimes we see people picking up, incorrect economic information, or that we might judge to be unfairly pessimistic, by accident. But then I think sometimes we see people who almost seem to actively seek it out. Some of the populist economics writers of recent years like to argue that wages have been stagnant, or living standards have even declined for average Americans since, say, pick your baseline, the 50s, the 70s, the 90s. It sort of depends who's making the argument. you know but we've got some, I think, really good analysis from some other economists, including uh, previous guests on the show. It's like Michael Strain of AEI. He was our, I guess, he was our second ever guest on episode 2. And he wrote a book a few years ago called "The American Dream Is Not Dead, but Populism Could Kill It." And Norbert Michel, more recently from Cato, was here for episode 134. He wrote his book called "Crushing Capitalism." Um, Both of those books are kind of on similar orientation, and they find very much, the opposite in the question of, supposedly stagnating and declining living standards. But I think it's not just a case of sort of he said, she said dispute where one economist has study A and it says, a certain thing, and the other economist has study B and it says the opposite, and they argue. Norbert likes to say, I think I've heard him say this a couple times, that, imagine there's 50 potential ways that you could measure living standards over time with different data sets and deflators and adjusters and things. And that we've seen somewhere between, significant and dramatic increases in, 49 out of 50 of those measurement methods, right? That, it's very lopsided in favor of saying that we have in fact been seeing increasing living standards over time, again, for the average household, for the median household, for working class households, etc. So why? I guess the question is, why do you think this is more of a psychology question than a economics question? I guess, why do you think we have so many pundits and commentators that seem to gravitate to the most doomer stats and interpretations possible, rather than saying, oh, things aren't as good as they could be, maybe they should be better. We have a sort of like, to quote, President Trump's first inaugural address, American carnage.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a psychology, but also a political science type question, right? Like why focus on the negative? I think it's, if you want to rally people to do something, saying, oh, things are fine, things are good, like doesn't actually, rally people. I think I
Right.
mean, rally might read me as an optimistic economist, but I think for most people that's not what motivates them. They're motivated by fear or, a narrative of decline like this, to say, and I have the solution, right? Not only is there a narrative decline, but I have the solution. I think this just seems to, you know, play well with a, certain portion of the population. So I think, that's maybe why. But, the way I try to think about this is, the 49 out of 50 that are good, what about the one that's not? I mean, I try to be, even though I'm a very optimistic guy and I try to look at long-term data sets, I think it's important to understand the ways in which, things actually might be worse over some time frame. So, the one which is not, this is not a minor one, this is a big one. Housing truly is, more expensive than 20 years ago relative to income. Like you do
Mhm.
all the quality adjustments you want. Like housing, and it's not just in the major metros anymore. It's in almost every state. Housing is more expensive. It's gone up more than income in the past 20 years. And this is something where I think it's useful to say, I'm writing a book on these sorts of things right now, and I have a whole chapter on housing to say, look, this is an exception to the general trend of, increasing prosperity. You can go back to the 70s and say it's quality improvements, but in the past 20 years, you can't say quality improvements because most houses already had air conditioning. They definitely had indoor plumbing. They haven't gotten bigger in the last 20 years. And so to talk about that, to be honest about the ways in which things are harder for people to buy, but then to say, okay, what are the policy solutions here, right? The policy solution is not tariffs to like protect
Mhm.
housing, right? It's like it's local housing policy. It's kind of the nuts and bolts of that. And you know, supply side restrictions, other forms of zoning, things like that. Like to talk about those things. So I think that's where I try to, say, okay, here's the 1 out of 50 where things are worse, but let's actually think through why that is and think about, is there something we can do? And in this case, most of what you need to do is deregulation, right? That is
Mhm.
actually, it's mostly for the government to get out of the way. I suppose that's very convenient for a libertarian to say that, but
Mhm.
like in housing, this is, I mean, even for folks on the left, right, that are think about housing, like they agree that this is like the big thing, right? I mean, there are still a few folks on the left that say we need more public housing, but most of them say, yes, it's about the supply side restrictions. So I think this is something where, there is pretty wide agreement among people that study this across the spectrum that like that's like at least one of the really big things is we need housing deregulation in various ways. So that's kind of how I approach that. Yes, people like pessimism, but you got to acknowledge some things they're right about, like some things that actually are harder to do, like buy that first house.
Yeah, absolutely. Uh, so, unlike us ivory tower eggheads in the think tank world who don't have to deal with any real people. Professors in the classroom do have to deal with real people. In this case, college students. You mentioned before we started that you're on sabbatical currently, but with the exception this semester accepted, you generally do have to deal with real human beings sitting in seats. Um, when it comes to the bright young minds of the future in the 21st century, um, what economic concepts do you think they struggle with the most? And I wonder, um, I was just at an estate sale recently, and I found uh, a copy of the U.S. News and World Report Guide to Colleges 1995, and that was the year that I started my undergraduate education at Claremont Mechanic College, Claremont, California. And I'm pretty sure my parents bought that exact same copy of U.S. News and World Report College Guide for 1995 when I was in high school. And so I was just because I happened to see that I was putting myself back in the mind of being a college student, thinking about how I was what my daily schedule was like and all that kind of stuff, and thinking about where I was learning about stuff out there in the world about public affairs, about news, and we were required to subscribe to a print newspaper as a student. So I had a New York Times subscription. I felt very sophisticated, and the internet was just taking off. I think you could still count all the websites in the world, yourself over the course of a day if you wanted to. So my background is very old school, and I was just kind of the pivot point moving from print to digital. When you have students come in today, is it all TikTok and ChatGPT? Are they still reading newspapers or the news websites? Where are they getting their information about this stuff? And is it solid? Is it good? Are they getting good information?
No, I mean that's something I'm always trying to learn myself because I do spend a lot of my time in the classroom with students trying to teach them mostly introductory economics courses. And I come from a similar generation as you. I started in college in 1998, so it was beginning of the internet, but still most media was what we call today traditional media. Um, yeah, I mean definitely my students do not read. I mean certainly not newspapers, but they don't even like for me, if I see like there's some noise about something maybe happening on social media, I'm like, okay, let me go to CNN and see like is something actually happening, right? Or is it just some noise on Twitter? I don't think that's what my students do though. They're not going to like see, oh, is CNN reporting on this? And is it true, right? Or is it something happening? So I think that they do, I don't know if it's all TikTok, but it is social media driven. That they see that as a lot of them, to some extent, some of them more than others, kind of curate the people that they think are good to follow, and that's who they rely on. And it's a little obscure to me how they figure out who's reliable. It's again me, old guy, right? Like CNN's reliable, right? I mean, that's not what they would think. But I think that that is a challenge then with trying to ask them because they do have a good conception of what's going on, right? Like they know that there's all these new tariffs this year. Like they know that, right? And so in Econ 101, we talk about tariffs and we talk about trade. Like they know that's going on. So they're still getting the news, but it is definitely in a much more decentralized way and in a way that is, a little more fluid in terms of who are you listening to right now this week. It might be, different TikTok influencers this week than last week, but they still are aware, right? And they are, you know, informed in some way. But I think that you do need to do a lot more of, they say, I heard this. Like, well, okay, where'd you hear this? And let's talk about, is that true? I feel like there's a lot more of that than, I've been teaching for almost 20 years now. I think there's a lot more of that now than there was 20 years ago, just because there are many so different entry points into where they're getting their information from. But I think they still are. I would say they're just as well informed as a college freshman was 20 years ago about, the basics of what's happening in the world. Is there a war in this country? Who is the president and what are the president's major things he's trying to do? Like they still know all that, so they're getting it from somewhere. I'm just trying to figure out where.
All right. Well, this is a never-ending race to find out where the kids are getting their information these days. But in the words of a 1990s classic, I believe the children are our future. So we will teach them well and let them lead the way. Um, Jeremy, this has been an excellent conversation. Thank you so much. I think you've taught all of us a lot. And before we go, tell us where should people find all of your stuff online?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. This was a lot of fun. I'm on Twitter quite a bit. My handle is JMHORP, or you can just search for my weird last name, Horpedahl. One of the only ones on Twitter. I write for a blog called Economists Writing Every Day. And I don't write every day, I write once a week, but we have a group of economists that from, various different schools and different, ideologies and schools of thought, write, and everything's very interesting. I'm an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, so I blog there 1 or 2 times a month on public policy issues. I think those are the main places to find me. If you're somehow listening to this and you're in Central Arkansas, we do lots of events on campus that are open to the public, not just students. So I do things like that, but that's not part of really my online presence.
Oh, right. Yeah. Arkansas folks, hit up Professor Horpedahl. All right. Follow him on Twitter and Jeremy, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. It's been good talking to you.